Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Waldman. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, what day is it today? It's Tuesday, September 12th. Just checking in, making sure that we have everything on deck here. Oh, listen to this. I've got some auto-playing video in the background, this time not on the main computer running the show, thankfully, I guess, so maybe you didn't even hear that interference. CNN, I'll get you. But at least everything is up and running and looks like it's working. Signals are thumbs up from Justice. That's the good news. Of course, it being Tuesday, we are without Greg Dworkin this morning, although I did see the auto-playing video is a link from a tweet that he circulated as well this morning. We will get to a lot of that. What do you want to do today? I mean, I can just let the show go and let Russians take over and do the whole thing. The morning tweet from Bill in Portland, Maine, of course, referencing that. Today, Kagro X is replaced with a Russian bot. Hilarity ensues, but it'll all be spelled wrong. That's the important part. But since it's verbal, you might be able to get away with that. Russia's doing everything else. The big story of the morning was supposed to be, I think, the reporting in the Daily Beast revealing that Russian manipulators basically were behind all, well, not all, but behind some. And who knows, it may even have been a small number of such rallies of Trump supporters, white supremacists, etc. But at least one of the rallies organized last year in 2016 in, I think, Twin Falls, Idaho, was what the story said. We'll get to the story in just a moment. But big story reported by, Ben Collins, Kevin Poulsen, and Spencer Ackerman had a part in the byline on this thing for the Daily Beast. That was big news last night. If you are a Twitter fan of any or all of those guys and the people who work with them, and you were up not that late, up last evening and on Twitter, which you really shouldn't necessarily have been. You should have been spending more time with your families, but we know how that goes. And you might have seen them teasing the news, and you got your standard Twitter line of standby for some breaking news, et cetera, et cetera. And this was it. This was the breaking news, and it was a big one, a big step forward in developing the Russia story, but there was more other things happening on the Russian front. We could spend all day on Trump, Russia, and maybe we will. But then the thunder was stolen. Oh my God, it was Ted Cruz. I mean, it doesn't take much to get us distracted. I assume by now everybody has heard the story. And I don't know, I didn't read much about it. There aren't any think pieces about it yet that I know of. So Ted Cruz, he's a guy in the Senate. He's from Texas. He's ultra conservative. Maybe you know a little bit about him. And I don't know. He has a Facebook page. And what did he do? He liked, Facebook liked a porn thing, a online porn page, and it posted a picture like right up at the top of his Ted Cruz website. I don't know if it's his official Ted Cruz Loves America website. I don't know, it's a PAC thing. I don't know if it's his personal one. I don't know if it's his Senate one. I don't know if it's his I'm still running for president one. Who cares? First thing on top of the page is a big porn thing with a picture and everything, because that's what porn's really about. I mean, he could have posted, say, some literary erotica from Trump Tower, the novel. That might have been even classier. Or he may have written his own novel with some weird sex in it that had something to do with Campbell's soup. That could have been a possibility. I really thought that, I had to tweet about it last night, and I really thought that Ted Cruz porn would involve soup somehow. But I have the sweetest, most lovable, most innocent Twitter machine on my phone who thinks very highly of me, and it auto-corrected the word porn to poem, which I thought was very sweet, really, for it to do. Very nice of you to think of me that way. Probably, in all likelihood, any Ted Cruz poetry in existence would also include Campbell's soup and maybe hundreds of cans of it at the same time. But yeah, I was surprised at the porn thing, but I don't know if that's a porn genre. I imagine they're all out there at some level somewhere. You just got to look at the right corner of the web, and maybe it's just too difficult to find the soup porn. So he went with this other stuff, which by all indications was pretty standard fare porn-wise. So I guess this is maybe the most normal thing there is about Ted Cruz. It would have been disturbing, but par for the course had there been soup or, I don't know, who even knows what kind of craziness you can come up with in the porn world. I think we all have a pretty good idea. But it stayed there for quite a long time, which, I don't know. I'm not sure who posts to the Ted Cruz Facebook page. I don't know whether there's somebody else he can blame for this, but it was up there a long time. He had to be woken up in the morning, I'm sure, to like, Ted, or depending on who gives him the news, Senator, some bad news, about 12 hours of porn on your, well, it wasn't 12 hours of porn, but the porn stayed there for quite a while. So, okay, so now he goes around saying, gee whiz, sorry, or I was hacked, or some staffer accidentally. I guess I'm a little bit curious what he comes up with by way of excuse. Maybe it's already out there. I don't know. Like I said, a little bit curious, so that if it's out there and I stumble across it, we'll read it. Or if you stumble across it, you can send it to me. I don't know. I assume the only thing that makes any sense for him to do today is to say he was hacked, but I don't know whether that's going to fly. Let's see. Oh, here's Olivier Knox addressing the question. Going to go with this reply to my question about whether I should find out what happened to Cruz today. Oh, he doesn't even know yet. And Courtney List tells him probably not. And it's really best if we just leave him alone and move on. But he's such a hypocrite and just says such horrible things about other people and their anything from their sexual peccadillos to their entire lifestyle, if it happens to, be something you can, if you're fanatical enough, pin to sex, as opposed to, look, people do things, and they conduct the rest of their lives outside of the bedroom, and maybe we should talk about some of those things. But, being a hypocrite and being such a fundamentalist chaser, I guess, in the come election time, it's a little bit funnier. But I guess we could be done with that for now, and we could talk about Trump and Trump Russia. And I got some nice sort of compliments yesterday. People found yesterday's show very interesting, and I thought it was a fun one. And but I got some interesting comments about, for instance, somebody saying, the description about Trump Tower, the novel, was very entertaining and sort of almost, I don't know whether this was somebody who was new to the show or just sort of trying to hook other people on the show, both of which I would appreciate equally, I think. Just sort of commenting on how it was almost in Trump's voice, almost as though I were speaking for Trump or as Trump. And of course, that's part of the point of what we're doing. But on the other hand, I also got the sort of, I guess, backhanded compliment, which was, the Trump imitation has now become, as they said, so good and such second nature that it kind of turns my stomach. It ruins the show to hear Donald Trump invading your, hopefully, favorite podcast and morning radio show. Well, we're probably going to do it again. Not much we can do about that. He kind of worms his way into everything. Let's take a quick look around and review what's going on. The story that was supposed to get all the attention in the morning, besides Ted Cruz, was, as I mentioned, this Daily Beast piece, exclusive, and that's how you know. That's why I say it's a Daily Beast piece. It's exclusive. It excludes all other media outlets, which is really a little bit elitist, but never mind that. Exclusive. Russia used Facebook events to organize anti-immigrant rallies on U.S. soil, which, by the way, is the best soil. But okay. Pushing fake news was just one component of the Russian campaign to shape American minds, Part 2, organizing anti-immigrant events, echoing themes from the pro-Trump press. I did see a couple of reports about this report circulating on Twitter where the headline was, Russia organized rallies and events of that nature in the United States using Facebook, and illustrated with a photo from Charlottesville. No evidence of which I am aware at the moment that the Russians organized the Charlottesville march, but wouldn't that be an explosive charge? And it wouldn't be surprising, given this story and the rest of the context that we have about Russian operations, if some of the people who were involved in the organization of Charlottesville had Russian connections of their own, or were being essentially sponsored or paid through various shell organizations by Russians or Russian oligarchs or the Russian government. And it should be borne in mind here as well that there's almost no such thing among the Russian oligarchy as private citizens simply making their own private decisions about how they'll spend their money. I think when the Facebook angle began to blow up and we were reading about how Facebook was tracing ad sales, political ad sales to Russian corporations and oligarchs that ran them, some of the pushback was, hey, in America, you're allowed to spend your money any way you want it. So a private individual in Russia decides that they want to back a certain political candidate, so they spend their money this way. There's nothing you can do about that. There's nothing wrong with that. Well, of course, it is illegal under American law, so we do tend to try to want to do things about that. And I should dig that one up, too, because I thought that one was really odd. They said, a private individual in Russia decides he wants to do some advertising for something he cares about in the world, and just not in his country. But it's the leader of the free world. It's going to make a difference in Russia who the president is. And granted, that's probably true. But all of a sudden, the guy makes some private decisions about how to spend his private money, and all of a sudden it's a violation of American sovereignty, which led me to think, well, yeah, wonderful, terrific. We're finally at the stage in this controversy where Russians are Russia-splaining American sovereignty to Americans. This is the fun part we've all been waiting for. I think we have a pretty decent grip on our own ideas about our own sovereignty. Not that there aren't people who have it wrong, and not that I couldn't end up being one of them, but I like to imagine that I'm not. But it was an interesting way of expressing resistance to the idea that there was something wrong with Russians doing this. And I guess in some sense, that's just a conceit we hold out for ourselves, which is unusual given that we are who we are. And the president of the United States is going to make a big difference all over the world. Maybe they should be able to influence our elections in some sense, but in a more abstract way, I think. And they do affect our elections in that way. When leaders of foreign countries typically weigh in, it usually they typically follow a certain protocol because you're talking about a contest between normal-ish candidates for office, and either one is going to, whoever wins, they're going to treat allies with a certain amount of respect and enemies with a certain amount of disdain. And that's not the case necessarily with Donald Trump, and so that creates a problem, and maybe you're going to see some unusual level of activity from foreign leaders there, but they weigh in to a certain extent, by giving both candidates the imprimatur of neither one of them are noticeably insane, so that's good. And other than that, respect the wishes of American voters and stay out of your way. But new situation calls for, I guess, a new protocol, and every once in a while you're going to have to speak up and say, yeah, this guy actually can't do this job, and maybe you shouldn't elect him. But they were hands off pretty much for the most part, except the Russians. They meddled. Should they have been allowed to? No, not according to American law. But let's set that aside just for a moment and wonder about whether or not it's proper for them to want to have some control, because that's really, I guess if you're looking for what motivates Russian operatives and the Russian government and the wider Russian oligarchy. It's going to be the things that they want, or the things that Putin says they should want, or he'll kill them otherwise, for instance. And that can substitute. It's a good stand-in for things I want. I want to live, don't I? Okay. Want to remain rich? Yeah, probably. Well, then these are the things that you should pretend you want, because Vladimir Putin wants them, and he'll have your head cut off or, disappear you if you don't like that. Okay. I can get with that. That's not fair. It's not right, but I can deal. It was an interesting angle to take. Anyway, I guess they certainly naturally will want to interfere, so they did. Now, we should probably get back to that other story about Facebook. We should do an about face and go back to that story about Facebook. But let's start with this one. Very interesting. Russian operatives hiding behind false identities, and that's another of the issues. We understand why they did that, because they knew that it was against U.S. law, and why involve the complication of being investigated by the FBI if you can do this without fingerprints. I don't know whether they really believed they were going to get away with the whole thing without leaving any fingerprints, but I don't think they cared very much. But, well, from the outset, why don't you guys pretend you're Americans and not raise suspicions for as long as we can? Russian operatives hiding behind false identities used Facebook's event management tool to remotely organize and promote political protests in the U.S., including an August 2016 anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim rally in Idaho, the Daily Beast has learned. A Facebook spokesperson confirmed to the Daily Beast that the social media giant shut down several promoted events as part of the takedown we described last week. So sort of fast forward from August 2016, we're now putting it in context. Yes, just last week, Facebook said, oh yeah, so the Russians, they did a whole lot of things on Facebook, which made us a nice sum of money, and we're a little bit embarrassed about that. And also it's illegal, and we were thinking maybe we could shut some of that down. And some of the things we shut down last week are connected or similar in nature to this operation that resulted in at least this one protest in August of 2016. That's what I'm gleaning from this. The company declined to elaborate, except to confirm that the events were promoted with paid ads. This is the first time the social media giant has publicly acknowledged the existence of such events. The Facebook events, one of which echoed Islamophobic conspiracy theories pushed by pro-Trump media outlets. Wink, wink. I think we all have some idea what those might be. Are the first indication that the Kremlin's attempts to shape American political discourse moved beyond fake news and led unwitting Americans into specific real-life actions. And that's kind of important, and I'm glad it's being brought up. Let's see. Oh, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to switch the orientation of some of the stuff on my screens so that I can perhaps more easily follow along on any Twitter chatter that's going on. Let's see. So I don't think we've missed any of your comments to date, so we'll continue on here. This is the next step. Clint Watts, calling his name a lot these days, a former FBI agent and expert on Russia's influence campaign, told the Daily Beast, the objective of influence is to create behavior change. The simplest behavior is to have someone disseminate propaganda that Russia created and seeded. The second part of behavior influence is when you can get people to physically do something. Interesting. Yes, that's true. Casting a ballot a certain way would be one of those things. Organizing for protest, probably even more complicated. Last week, Facebook acknowledged for the first time that Russia used false identities and about 3,000 ads to spread politically divisive posts to Americans before and after the election. The content, according to an expert on Facebook's advertising system, was likely seen by between 23 and 70 million people. That is quite a few, based on the $100,000 ad buy alone. Much of the Russian Facebook propaganda campaign has since been deleted. But bits and pieces remain visible in search engine caches, including a 2016 notice on Facebook Events, the site's event management and invitation tool, announcing an August 27th rally in rural Idaho, known to a rural Idaho town known to welcome refugees. And that's why it was targeted. Due to the town of Twin Falls, Idaho becoming a center of refugee resettlement, which led to the huge upsurge of violence towards American citizens. Did it really? It probably did not. It is crucial to draw society's attention to this problem, the event notice began. That counts as fake news right there. The 3-hour protest was titled Citizens Before Refugees and would be held at the city council chambers beginning at 11 a.m. The notice provided the street address and ended with a fiery exhortation. They must stop talking and start protesting. But they were saying, we must stop taking in Muslim refugees. We demand open and thorough investigation of all the cases regarding Muslim refugees. All government officials who are covering up for these criminals should be fired. Of course, the added irony of all of this, the protest is titled Citizens Before Refugees, and the irony, of course, being that the organization was bought and paid for by people who are not American citizens. They're not refugees either, but they're not American citizens. But they're like I said, they are America-splaining American anger about refugees where it exists to Americans. And Americans are saying, yes, absolutely. These Russians know better how I feel than I do, my neighbors do, or any politician in America does. And it might even be true. The event was hosted by, quote, Secured Borders. That is one word here, but Secured Borders, a putative U.S. anti-immigration community that was outed in March as a Russian front. The Facebook page had 133,000 followers when Facebook closed it last month. Of course, I guess there's probably some question about how many of those are real. Some of them undoubtedly are real, actual Americans who were fooled into thinking the organization was run by real, actual other Americans, but it wasn't. But I imagine probably some significant portion of it are, in fact, Russian bots or Russian operatives looking to populate the page with followers and likes, so that the few idiots that wandered in from America don't feel like they're the first ones at the party. You know what I mean? Although 48 people clicked that they were interested in the protest, only 4 said they went to city council chambers that day, according to the event page. That's not very exciting, is it? Possibly because it was a Saturday and the council was not in session. It is also possible to claim attendance on Facebook at an event that didn't exist. Some of the profiles of interested rally-goers listed themselves as Twin Falls residents. Of course, if you were a Russian operative and you knew that the event was in Twin Falls, you might also identify your fake self as a resident of Twin Falls. Facebook did not explain if the several promoted events were upcoming ones at the time that the account was deactivated, or whether there were events that had already occurred at the time of deactivation. But the spokesman confirmed that the promoted events were paid events akin to the inflammatory ads that the company disclosed last week. Far-right pro-Trump fire hoses, hey, I like the way they used that word, and let's say they took it from me. I didn't invent the word fire hose, but you know what I'm talking about. Far-right pro-Trump fire hoses, Breitbart, InfoWars, and WorldNet Daily had pushed a series of stories implying immigrants were taking over Twin Falls since the beginning of 2016. Finally, some explanation of how it was that Twin Falls ended up getting targeted in this. These stories reached a fever pitch in the month before Secured Borders' event. Secured Borders' event, that is. A WorldNet Daily writer called Chobani's plan, the yogurt company, to hire immigrants to work at the Twin Falls plant, an Islamic surge, in a January 2016 piece once titled, American Yogurt Tycoon Vows to Choke U.S. with Muslims. That post's headline has since been changed and the Islamic surge wording was removed. One InfoWars article claimed that Chobani's workers were responsible for a 500% increase in tuberculosis in Twin Falls. I don't know what the tuberculosis rate in Twin Falls was in the first place, but I doubt they even bothered to check before making that one up. InfoWars and Alex Jones published videos with the titles MSM, mainstream media, covers for globalists' refugee import program after child rape case. Can't make them mad by telling people that immigrants are being given jobs, which, after all, it's kind of, I mean, it's part of what we wanted, right? But for those of us who are willing to take in refugees at all, you certainly want to hope that they get jobs here. And one of the chief complaints of people who are anti-immigrant is very frequently that they come here and then they just take welfare. They don't work for a living. And then, of course, if they do get jobs, they say, well, they stole those jobs from Americans. All the migrant Americans moving to Twin Falls to work at the yogurt plant, of course, are the ones who were so disappointed in all of this. So they can't get people riled up about that. So tell them there's a huge increase in tuberculosis. Most people say, I don't know how to even pronounce that, so tuberculosis doesn't worry me too much. What about the other stuff? Well, how about child rape? Well, that always worries me. And there's some dramatic music to prove the point, I guess. That's, of course, the music that says we need to take a break at this point for station identification and a little bit of water and to turn off the phone, which I forgot to do. But we'll be back with more about this story, more about Trump and Russia and all the things that are terrible about all of them after this. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I just let the music roll all the way through to see if there was anything really super interesting at the end of the file that we might use for re-entry music, but it's about the same. That's a nice way of doing things. I should probably, now that's an idea. I should cut a file of that music that's exactly the length of the break and fades itself out. I need to automate more of what we do here. Both at the exhortation of Scott Anderson, who has some excellent ideas about how we might do that. And I know that it's automated, well, it was programmed by Justice over on his end. There's really no reason why I should have to hand carve out all of these things. And they're going to make my life simpler. That's my resolution going forward. I have to save that for New Year's when it's time for me to come up with a New Year's resolution. They don't really do New Year's resolutions per se for Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year, and lunar calendar is still difficult for Americans to figure out. So I'll do it next time. I'll use the American New Year to deal with that, and you didn't need to know that. But let's continue now that we're back on the show. Thanks for listening. If you have some ideas about how other things we might automate or how to use these programs that can do all these fantastic things, Scott pointed me to this Automator program on Mac. I've gotten used to the Mac environment, but I'm not originally a Mac person, and I'm not a coder or a programmer, and I was a little bit lost in the tutorial of Automator, but an excellent idea, and I have to study up on this. But if any of you know any cool shortcuts or ways to explain what the hell this thing is and how to make it do the things I want to do, that would be much appreciated. And I'll catch up, and one day life will be simpler. And then we'll be able to focus on things like this article, where we left off before the break. InfoWars and Alex Jones were taking things up a notch by insisting that the refugees who were being gainfully employed by Chobani Yogurt in Twin Falls, Idaho, were child rapists and ought to be thrown out of the country, because that's the sort of thing that gets people riled up, and there's no way to really check on that. And it's an easy charge to level, and people who are racist and bigoted are easily excited over such things. By the way, over the break, I guess I should make some mention, just to call back to the other show, the other story from the beginning of the show. The porn site that Ted Cruz posted on his Facebook page has tweeted, "Thanks for watching, Ted." So that's That's well worth mentioning, I think. I'll see if we can share that tweet with you later on. Okay, so didn't mean to get too distracted by all of that. Back now to the news, if you will. So what's going on in Twin Falls, and what did the Daily Beast find out for us? When, InfoWars and Alex Jones were making these terrible allegations, including the child rape case, and ran another headline, Idaho yogurt maker caught importing migrant rapists. Both of those headlines, by the way, since removed. They did the damage they were supposed to do, and now they're gone, which tells you a little bit about whether or not, Breitbart, InfoWars, and the rest really are journalistic efforts and ought to be recognized and given press passes to this White House. I mean, if you're a normal person, you would say no. That means no. But if you're a White House communications director, which, by the way, is a job now going to Hope Hicks, how does she do it? Well, I would say the answer is going to come out differently, and it has to date. When Chobani, the company, sued InfoWars over the claims in April, Jones initially claimed that he was, quote, not backing down. His voice, I'm never giving up. I love this. And that I'm choosing this as a battle. On this I will stand. I will win or I will die. Should I be using flowerier language like that on our program? Should I get flighty with things? Jones, however, settled 3 weeks later, and I will win or I will die, or I will settle in 3 weeks, and was forced to issue a retraction of the false stories InfoWars invented about immigrants in Twin Falls. Some of the offending articles and videos have since been removed. Breitbart, which was not sued by Chobani, still has a story titled TB spiked 500% in Twin Falls during 2012 as Chobani yogurt opened plant on its website. Tuberculosis cases, by the way, rose from 1 to 6 in 2012, then dropped back down to 2 in 2013. There is no proof in the article tying tuberculosis to immigrants. The tuberculosis story was posted 1 day before Secured Borders' real-life rally was set to take place in Twin Falls. They needed an anger point, for some reason, to focus themselves, and that was it. The story was one of dozens of negative Breitbart stories about immigrants in Twin Falls in August of 2016. In the month before Secured Borders created its Facebook event, Breitbart posted 37 articles about immigrants in Twin Falls. 37 articles about immigrants in Twin Falls, Idaho. Many of the stories, like one titled Twin Falls Rape Special Report, Why Are the Refugees Moving In?, revolve around what Breitbart called a gang rape that Twin Falls County Prosecutor Grant Loebs said was misreported. There was no gang rape, no knife attack, and we did not charge anybody with rape because no rape occurred. That's a good reason. Loebs told the Magic Valley Times News, which is a real newspaper and apparently a real place. It sounds like a children's television show, the Magic Valley, but it's not. There is a small group of people in Twin Falls County whose life goal is to eliminate refugees, and thus far they have not been constrained by the truth. That's what actually happened in all of this. Okay, well, weird and interesting and revealing in terms of the sophistication of the Russian operation. That is, that it got down to the level of let's try and do things that will move real people to real action on the ground in America. Real America, even, you could say. I wouldn't, but lots of them would. But on the other hand, if 4 people showed up, I don't know how, it's a sophisticated idea, but I guess they didn't do such a great job in executing it. Bad targeting there, right? How many people are you going to get to turn out in Twin Falls? Probably not that many. It's not a huge population center, I would guess. So, for instance, you might do better saying, let's start by organizing in New York City. Now, that might be bad demographics for you in terms of your audience, but at least the numbers are there to support some kind of turnout. You could do a terrible job organizing in New York City and still get more than 4 people to show up, maybe even just by accident. Any place you take a picture of in New York City is going to have more than 4 people in it. even if it's a bathroom, it's possible. So, or a single stall, it could happen. It could happen anywhere. But New York City, well, it's the city that never sleeps, and some of the people never sleep either, and then they find themselves, okay, all right, let's not get all Ted Cruz about things here. What's the population, you think, of Twin Falls? Joan, do you know offhand? Twin Falls, about how many people are there? Let's see. Twin Falls, Idaho, population. We're going to find out. It might be the wrong number, but the 2016 population, that's what we're talking about, 48,260. So that's not a backwater. It's one of the bigger cities, I'm sure. It might even say in Wikipedia what in number it ranks in cities in Idaho, but that's a pretty significant number of people to draw from. But looks like they got about one in almost every 10,000, or a little bit more than every 10,000 people showed up. So that's a pretty it's a pretty good turnout. In New York City, it would be larger, is all I'm saying. I don't know, but whatever reason, they were really focused in on this Chobani yogurt place, and the reason, of course, being that the guy was sympathetic to refugees and thought he would give them gainful employment. I own a yogurt company. I need workers. I share some ethnicity and background, perhaps, with these guys, and so I'll employ them. And now everybody's furious. Oh, they're coming here, getting gainful employment. Usually, it's the sort of thing that you would be happy with. Like, wow, they chose Twin Falls as the production headquarters of this now major national yogurt brand. That's a point of civic pride. But apparently not, because a few more people than usually get tuberculosis here have gotten tuberculosis. And obviously they carried it with them all the way to Syria. And nobody is eating the yogurt and getting sick. But I don't know. They're coughing on people after they get out of work. And all hell breaks loose. Obviously they only dislike them because they're brown and possibly Muslim. And that's enough of an excuse for them, I guess. Not for the rest of us, though. What have we elsewhere in our pocket? There's probably some additional material out there on these rallies and the various things that they have been working on. But we'll transition to other areas in Trump Russia. Some things we're a little bit behind on. Some Russian mobster / oligarch names we have to enter onto the record or report on if they have already been mentioned. And we could probably fill the day that way, and we probably will. Before we transition off of rallies, though, back to Charlottesville, some news on the fallout from Charlottesville. Let's see, I'm going to scroll back a little ways too, because I think there was a similar effort on in the House not that long ago, and I thought it was kind of a fun and interesting story. But the one that's immediately at hand is Senate action. Reported by The Hill, Jordan Carney writing the piece up for The Hill. Senate approves resolution condemning white supremacist groups. And I think they've changed their headline a little bit now. Well, maybe not. Maybe the tweet that brought it to my attention had a different headline. But this is interesting. The Senate easily passed a resolution on Monday condemning white supremacist organizations and, this is the fun part, urging President Trump to speak out against hate groups. That's, of course, not binding in any sense, but it raises the political pressure on him, and he'll ignore it, and good, that means there'll be increased political pressure on him. The resolution, introduced last week by Senators Mark Warner, of course, a Democrat of Virginia, Johnny Isakson, a Republican of Georgia, Tim Kaine, the other Democrat from Virginia, and Cory Gardner, a Republican of Colorado, cleared the upper chamber by unanimous consent. The Senate measure formally condemns the violence and domestic terrorist attack that occurred last month around a white supremacist rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. And it's enclosed in quote marks there, quotation marks, so I assume that means that the resolution itself labeled that murder, that vehicular murder, as domestic terrorism. Properly so, but it's a point of some controversy with bigots and people who are embarrassed by right-wing activism. In addition to urging Trump and the administration to publicly push back against hate groups, the resolution urges Trump and his cabinet to, quote, address the growing prevalence of those hate groups in the United States. Senators want Attorney General Jeff Sessions, and the Department of Homeland Security to investigate all acts of violence, intimidation, and domestic terrorism by white supremacists, white nationalists, or associated groups and prevent them, quote, from fomenting and facilitating additional violence. And now you've got a foreign intelligence angle on that, too, since we're learning this morning that it is, in fact, Russians fomenting some of that additional violence and white supremacists rallies, etc. The resolution formally gained the backing of 57 senators, including the Senate Majority Leader, Mitch McConnell, before it passed the Senate on Monday night. Trump received widespread criticism for his response to violence in Virginia last month, including saying during a press conference that both what he called alt-left and white nationalist groups were there, and very fine people were on both sides. The rally began as a protest against the Charlottesville City Council's decision to remove the statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee, but turned violent and led to the death of one counter-protester. By murder, of course. You know how the story goes. But they could stand to remind everybody else. Our audience knows exactly how that how things led to the death of one counter-protester. Running her over with a car, that does lead to that. It happens frequently when cars are used to run people down. So why not just say so? Now, I think somewhere on my list, and I might not be able to ferret it out all that quickly, the way my pocket is disorganized, I guess I would have to say. But I am pretty sure, I thought that there was a similar effort on in the House, but it may have been the Senate-originated piece, and this may have been the very same one. But the idea was to sort of, it was being sold as a method of forcing Trump's hand on denouncing it. There it is. No, I guess it's the same one because I think that's a picture of Cory Gardner being used to illustrate it. It's a piece from Talking Points Memo, Caitlin McNeil piece from September 6th. Bipartisan resolution will force Trump to go on record on white nationalists. Let's see if we're talking about the same resolution. It's the same group of people, clearly, but I wonder if the resolution evolved at all. It was describing the same group of people, same senators, bipartisan group, planning to introduce a resolution on Wednesday. This was, again, written back on September 6th, condemning the white nationalists who participated in the Charlottesville rallies in August. Politico reported on Wednesday morning. That's the original source on that one. Looks like, let's see. The resolution was aimed at forcing Donald Trump to either sign or reject a condemnation. Yes, that was the interesting angle on it. They wanted to force his hand politically to either make a statement of his own or at the very least have to deal with this thing. So I was curious about it because ordinarily resolutions are not something that the president has to do anything with. It's not. Certainly the language of it is not binding on him, but if a Senate passes a resolution, Senate Resolution S-Res 25, whatever it is, the president says, okay, interesting, or as the case may be, not interesting. I don't care. The Senate resolves that I should do this, so what? The House and Senate together could do it in a concurrent resolution, but again, then the president would say, who cares? And again, resolutions don't go to the president for his signature. But there is one kind of resolution that does. I think that would be the joint resolution. And I guess we could check our terms here, but I'm pretty sure offhand that we're right about that one. And but the joint resolutions you're capable of imbuing them with the force of law, although I don't know that that's necessarily what they were aiming at here. But the point would be that a joint resolution is something that does land on the president's desk and has to be either signed or vetoed by him. So let's see. I'll just check that. It's one or the other. And, whenever I do something like this sort of off the cuff, then I always feel like I better double check, and I worry that I made the wrong call on it here. Let's see. A joint resolution is a legislative measure designated from the Senate side, SJ Res, and numbered consecutively, which requires the approval of both chambers, and with one exception, is submitted, just like a bill would be, to the president for possible signature into law. The one exception is that joint resolutions, and not bills, are used to propose constitutional amendments. Those resolutions require, of course, a 2/3 affirmative vote in each house and are not submitted to the president. They become effective when ratified by 3/4 of the states. Just a little civics lesson while we're on our way to the end of this story. So the question is, did they style this thing as a joint resolution? And it doesn't say in this story, and it didn't say in the previous story. We should just double check whether it says perhaps in the Politico story. But I don't know, a minor teaching moment that was out there that they didn't take advantage of and was perhaps edited out of the piece. But the strategic value of a joint resolution is that if it remained a joint resolution and was passed as a joint resolution, it will land on the president's desk, and he'll either have to sign it, veto it, or I guess you could sort of pocket sign it. Of course, if he does nothing and the Senate doesn't adjourn sine die so that the resolution can't be returned with a veto message, if he just waits on it for 10 days, it's approved. It becomes, I guess, law. Does this mean necessarily? It's a kind of an awkward thing. Like, what would they be making, codifying into law here? Nothing really, except that, such a proclamation was made on behalf of the Senate and the House concurring. The Congress let it be known. I mean, it's a weird thing to kind of insert into law. It has no business there. It has no effect. But I guess if they did follow through that way with a joint resolution, it was all about making the president either sign it or veto it or hide behind letting it just sit on his desk and becoming effective then. So some interesting rhetoric on the presentation of the piece, but no answer from these articles anyway in terms of how this thing was styled. I guess we could go and take a look. Why don't we do our research right here on the air and see. Let's see if it passed yesterday by unanimous consent. We might find it at the Democratic website for the Senate caucus. They might have wrapped it up in, there it is. It's a joint resolution. Yeah, we got it right. Senate Joint Resolution 49, condemning the violence and domestic terrorist attack that took place during events between August 11th and August 12th, 2017 in Charlottesville, Virginia, recognizing the first responders who lost their lives while monitoring the events, offering deepest condolences to the family and friends of those individuals who were injured by the violence, expressing support for the Charlottesville community, rejecting white supremacists, not White House supremacists. That's next. The Ku Klux Klan, neo-Nazis, and other hate groups, and urging the president and the president's cabinet to use all available resources to address the threats posed by these groups. So, Senate Joint Resolution adopted by unanimous consent Monday, and that starts the clock, and the president has to decide what to do with it. Oh, I'm sorry. The House has to deal with it next. And I guess that's a possibility. They could sit on it and not take it up, but that would put them on the spot. So, interestingly done, well played, and a bipartisan group in the Senate wise to send that over. And in a couple of days, it'll be time to start criticizing the House if they haven't agreed to take this thing up. And they should likewise do it by acclamation or voice vote and get the thing out of the way and pass it on to Donald Trump himself and let him figure out what to do with it. Okay, So that wraps up the stories of the protests. I think at the moment back to Pocket for the rest of our Trump-Russia special. And we got a little bit of time here to start before our next break. So let's perhaps start up at the top and dive in. Let's see. There's Trump-Russia business connection and there's Trump-Russia political connections. It all comes together at some point. Where should we begin? Well, how about this? Just by way of update, we'll take a look at this tweet which came in from Adkaratic, guessing at our pronunciation, who I suppose is possibly just a follower on Twitter versus listener on the show, maybe both. But this feels like it has the arc in mind of a radio listener as well. So welcome if you're out there, Adkaratic, ADKERRATIC, for those of you who'd like to join along. A ton of the Steele report, he says, she says, has since been corroborated. And there's a Slate piece linked in here, which the piece says was originally published over at Just Security, where we've gone a couple of times. But since Slate has it open here, let's take a look. John Cipher. What a name for a guy in the security business. But it's SIPHER. How much of the infamous document ended up being corroborated elsewhere? A whole lot. Worth noting. Recent revelations of Trump campaign connections to Russia have revived interests in the Steele dossier. The dossier is composed of a batch of short reports produced between June and December 2016 by Orbis Business Intelligence. I don't think I ever really got the name of the organization behind the work here. Orbis Business Intelligence, a London-based firm specializing in commercial intelligence for government and private sector clients. The collection of Orbis reports caused an uproar when it was first published online by BuzzFeed just 10 days before Donald Trump's inauguration. You know, the P-tape one. Taken together, the series of reports painted a picture of active collusion between the Kremlin and key Trump campaign officials based on years of Russian intelligence work against Trump and some of his associates. This seemed to complement general statements from the U.S. intelligence officials about Russia's active efforts to undermine the 2016 election. The greatest attention was paid to the first report, which conveyed salacious claims about Trump consorting with prostitutes in Moscow in 2013. Trump himself publicly refuted the story, which is probably, I would add, the best proof of its truth when Trump refutes the story. While Trump associates denied reported details about their engagement with Russian officials. A lot of ink and pixels were also spent on the question of whether it was appropriate for the media to publish the dossier. I remember all of that. Why bring this up again? I think we're all up to date on these things, but this actually has some interesting background on the mechanics of how the thing got produced, what it is, and why it's very likely to be corroborated, or it was likely to have been corroborated in most of its details, even if we're still waiting for the P-tape. So I did skim a little bit of this one, but I thought it was just interesting for that, but also to remind ourselves that it really was the dossier, and there were several of them, but they connected issues like his business dealings in Russia, the business dealings of his associates with Russians, and the salacious stuff, and now also, as it turns out, more of the interference in the election stuff, which wasn't much talked about when the dossier was first published. Almost immediately after the dossier was leaked, media outlets and commentators pointed out that the material was unproven. And that's true and worthwhile to point out. News editors affixed the terms unverified and unsubstantiated to all discussion of the issue. Political supporters of President Trump simply tagged it as fake news. Riding that wave, legendary Washington Post reporter Bob Woodward characterized the report as, quote, garbage. I don't think that has aged well. For professional investigators, however, the dossier is by no means a useless document. Although the reports were produced episodically, almost erratically, over a 5-month period, They present a coherent narrative of collusion between the Kremlin and the Trump campaign. That's where it becomes important. That wasn't what it was originally offered for, or I should say it wasn't how it was originally received. But it certainly has a lot to do with the purpose of offering it up to the intelligence community. Anyway, as a result, it says, they offer an overarching framework for what might have happened based on information from individuals on the Russian side who claim to have insight into Moscow's goals and operational tactics. Until we have another more credible narrative, we should do all we can to examine it closely and confirm or dispute the reports. All right, well, our break is nearly upon us. Let me at least set up for that so that we can move smoothly into it, and I'll give you a teaser of what's to come on the other side of the break over the music here. Many of my former CIA colleagues, John Cipher says, have taken the Orbis report seriously since they were first published. This is not because they are not fond of Trump, and many admittedly are not, but because they understand the potential plausibility of the report. We'll talk more about it later. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. We're back from our midway break, and I think that works out nicely. I should I'm gonna do a little editing work maybe over the weekend when I have a little bit more time. Make more progress towards automating these things. A little discussion going on in the background about that with Justice. So progress being made, and that we're talking about making progress later on. So put off the progress until later. That's what I always say. Okay. So where were we? Yes, many of the writers, former CIA colleagues, have taken the Orbis reports seriously. Not necessarily because they don't like Trump, but because they understand the potential plausibility of the report's overall narrative based on their experienced understanding of both Russian methods and the nature of raw intelligence reporting. Let's get into some of that, shall we? Immediately following the BuzzFeed leak, one of my closest former CIA colleagues told me that he recognized the reports as the obvious product of a former British Secret Intelligence Service officer, since the format, structure, and language mirrored what he had seen over a career of reading SIS reports provided to CIA in liaison channels. He and others withheld judgment about the veracity of the reports, but for the reasons I outline further below, they did not reject them out of hand. In fact, they were more inclined, for professional reasons, to put them in the trust but verify category. So, how should we unpack the Steele dossier from an intelligence perspective? I spent almost 30 years producing what the CIA calls raw reporting from human agents. At heart, this is what Orbis did. They were not producing finished analysis, but were passing on to a client distilled reporting that they had obtained in response to specific questions. When disseminating a raw intelligence report, an intelligence agency is not vouching for the accuracy of the information provided by the report's sources and or subsources. Rather, it is claiming that it has made strenuous efforts to validate that it is reporting accurately what the sources and subsources claim has happened. The onus for sorting out the veracity and for putting the reporting in context against other reporting, which may confirm or disconfirm the reporting, rests with the intelligence community's professional analytic cadre. In the case of the dossier, Orbis was not saying that everything that it reported was accurate, but that it had made a good faith effort to pass along faithfully what its identified insiders said was accurate. This is routine in the intelligence business, and this form of reporting is often a critical product in putting together more final intelligence assessments. There's an interesting parallel to our own public media, I guess, in a sense here. Sometimes we get very frustrated with our journalists who say, well, I can't speak to the veracity or truth of what's being claimed here. All I can tell you is I'm reporting it because a important person said it. And that frustrates us and says, what are you, a stenographer for that person? Well, you need to do the analysis. That's your job. I report, you decide. I mean, it's a little bit of a cop-out, and there's certainly levels at which that analysis is done in the mainstream media, and we ought not to ignore that. That's some of the best stuff that we share on this show. The analysis is always coming out. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad, but that's an interesting framework within which to understand what Orbis was doing here. Steele's product is not a report delivered with a bow at the end of an a bow, like I wrapped up in a bow, like a present. I think now, having read the rest of it, might be delivered with a bow at the end of an investigation. I don't know which they're talking about here, like wrapped up with a bow, or does he take a bow after he makes this presentation? I don't know. Instead, let's get to what it is. Instead, it is a series of contemporaneous raw reports that do not have the benefit of hindsight. Among the unnamed sources are a senior Russian foreign ministry official, a former top-level intelligence officer still active inside the Kremlin, and a close associate of Republican U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump. Thus, the reports are not an attempt to connect the dots, but instead an effort to uncover new and potentially relevant dots in the first place. Let me illustrate what the reports contain by unpacking the first and most notorious of the 17 Orbis reports, and then move to some of the other ones. The first 2.5-page report was dated June 20th, 2016, and entitled Company Intelligence Report 2016/080. I don't know what 080 is, but okay. It starts with several summary bullets and continues with additional detail attributed to sources A through E and G. There may be a source F, by the way, but part of the report is blacked out. The report makes a number of explosive claims, all of which at the time of the report were unknown to the public. Among other assertions, 3 sources in the Orbis report describe a multi-year effort by Russian authorities to cultivate, support, and assist Donald Trump, which of course makes sense in the context of the later reporting about the June 2016 meeting in Trump Tower between Donald Trump Jr., Jared Kushner, Paul Manafort, and Natalia Veselnitskaya and company, and why it was that the initial emails attempting to set up that meeting do not make any, or there's no extraordinary note taken of the writer's claim that the information Veselnitskaya has for Donald Trump Jr. is part of Russia's government's overall plan of operations to assist the Trump campaign. There's no realization, no exclamation from Donald Trump Jr. at any point saying, oh, the Russian government is actually trying to help us? I had no idea. So there you go. That's what's important, I think, for that one in terms of corroboration. According to the account, the Kremlin provided Trump with intelligence on his political primary opponents and access to potential business deals in Russia. Perhaps more importantly, Russia had offered to provide provincially compromising material on Hillary Clinton, consisting of bugged conversations during her travels in Russia and her evidence of her viewpoints that contradicted her public positions on various issues, which wouldn't be much of a surprise to anybody, but wouldn't necessarily be a particularly potent weapon in the hands of Donald Trump, if you really think about it. But since his audience was not really thinking about it, it might have worked after all. But there you are, right in the Steele dossier, which comes to our attention in January of 2017, we have foreshadowing of the reporting of the Trump Tower meeting, that there really was an active plan, and it was to deliver dirt on Hillary Clinton. The report also alleged that the internal Russian intelligence service, FSB, had developed potentially compromising material on Trump, including details of, quote, perverted sexual acts, unquote, which were arranged and monitored by the FSB. The report stated that Russian President Putin was supportive of the effort to cultivate Trump, and the primary aim was to sow discord and disunity within the U.S. and the West. The dossier of FSB collected information on Hillary Clinton was purportedly managed by Kremlin chief spokesman Dmitry Peskov. So in the previous story, for instance, the rally in Twin Falls and, of course, the discussion of the events in Charlottesville, that would be the sort of thing I think that the FSB would view as discord and disunity being sown within the United States and the West. They would mark that down as a success. Subsequent reports, that is, provide additional detail about the possible conspiracy, which includes information about cyber attacks against the U.S. They allege that the former Trump campaign chief Paul Manafort managed the plot to exploit political information on Hillary Clinton in return for information on Russian oligarchs outside Russia and an agreement to sideline Ukraine as a campaign issue. According to the report, Trump campaign operative Carter Page is also said to have played a role in shuttling information to Moscow, while Trump's personal lawyer, Michael Cohen, reportedly took over efforts after Manafort left the campaign, allegedly providing cash payment for Russian hackers. Wow. In one account, Putin and his aides expressed concern over kickbacks of cash to Manafort from former Ukraine President Viktor Yanukovych, which they feared might be discoverable by U.S. authorities. The Kremlin was more interested in that than the Trump guys were. The Kremlin also feared that the U.S. might stumble onto the conspiracy through the actions of a Russian diplomat in Washington, Mikhail Kalugin, and therefore had him withdrawn, according to the reports. Oh, I don't think I recall that part. In late fall 2016, the Orbis team reported that a Russian-supported company, had been using botnets and porn traffic to transmit viruses, plant bugs, steal data, and conduct altering operations against the Democratic Party leadership. Hackers recruited by the FSB under duress were involved with the operations. According to the report, Cohen insisted that payments be made quickly and discreetly, and that cyber operators should go to ground and cover their tracks. What great legal advice that is, except for the fact that it'll land you in jail. What should be made of these leaked reports with unnamed sources on issues that were deliberately concealed by participants? Honest media outlets have reported on subsequent events that appear to be connected to the reports, but do not go too far with their analysis, concluding still that the dossier is unverified. Almost no outlets have reported on these salacious sexual allegations, leaving the public with very little sense as to whether the dossier is true, false, important, or unimportant in that respect. While the reluctance of the media to speculate as to the value of the report is understandable, professional intelligence analysts and investigators do not have the luxury of simply dismissing the information. They instead need to do all they can to put it into context, determine what appears credible, and openly acknowledge the gaps in understanding so that collectors can seek additional information that might help make sense of the charges. In the intelligence world, we always begin with source validation, focusing on what intelligence professionals call the chain of acquisition. In this case, we would look for detailed information on, in this order, Orbis, Steele, his means of collection, e.g., who was working for him in collecting information, his sources, their subsources, witting or unwitting, and the actual people, organizations, and issues being reported on. Intelligence methodology presumes that perfect information is never available and that the vetting process involves cross-checking both the sources of the information as well as the information itself. There is a saying among spy handlers, vet the source first before attempting to vet the source's information. Information from human sources, the spies themselves, is dependent on their distinct access to information, and every source has a particular lens. Professional collectors and debriefing experts do not elicit information from a source outside of the source's area of specific access. They also understand that inaccuracies are inevitable even if the source is not trying to mislead. The intelligence process is built upon a feedback cycle that corroborates what it can and then goes back to gather additional information to help build confidence in that assessment. The process is dispassionate, unemotional, professional, and never-ending. Faced with the raw reports in the Orbis document, how might an intelligence professional approach the jumble of information? The first thing is to examine Christopher Steele, the author of the reports, and his organization, Orbis International. Are they credible? Steele was the president of the Cambridge Union and was a career British intelligence officer with service in Moscow, Paris, and Afghanistan prior to work as the head of the Russia desk at British Intelligence HQS. While in London, he worked as the personal handler of Russian defector Alexander Litvinenko. He was a respected professional who had success in some of the most difficult intelligence environments. He retired from SIS in 2009 and started Orbis Business Intelligence along with a former colleague. Prior to his work on the Russian dossier for Orbis, he was best known for his investigation of the World Soccer Association, FIFA. Again, FIFA back in the news. And amazingly, I know I hinted at this the other day, or I certainly meant to. I hope I did. But I think we're going to get ourselves back into FIFA, which was an amazing tale when we first told it, and I had forgotten that some of the major players in the FIFA scandal lived in Trump Tower. I don't know if they made it into the novel, but they lived in Trump Tower, and I found that amazing and just, potentially coincidental, but really not. Because also, where's the next World Cup being played? Does everybody know that? Did I read it correctly? Is Russia hosting the World Cup next? Is that really the case? With FIFA being this corrupt and Russian corruption turning up all over the place, and FIFA corruption involving Russians all over the place, and it's really rather amazing. Let's see. When's the next World Cup? 2018, right? Is that what we're talking about? In 2018 FIFA World Cup, Russia. Yeah. So that pretty much confirms it. Another sort of interesting dot, I guess we could say, maybe, sort of, to connect to all of this. Plus, of course, the residence of these folks in Trump Tower, where I don't know if we can say, well, of course that makes sense. And now Trump is in on the fix of FIFA and the World Cup. No, I don't think he was into that. But the Russian mobsters who live in Trump Tower certainly would have been interested in bringing the games to Russia and profiting off of it because they're gangsters, easy enough to figure out. Maybe they made it happen, and maybe they made it happen in the atmosphere that Donald Trump created and promoted. And remember, we discussed yesterday, at least initially when he was filling those units in Trump Tower, he was doing his damnedest to handpick the seedy, perverted weirdos that he ended up housing in Trump Tower and elsewhere. So, he's got a hand in all of this. By the way, I also thought FIFA is going to come up again as part of the team that Robert Mueller is assembling to do his investigative work. Very importantly, many of them are experienced in money laundering and the use of American luxury real estate, in particular for money laundering. Lots of them have some experience in ferreting out Russian organized crime in particular. And yes, I believe I read the other day that some of the experts on the team have investigative experience with the FIFA case. And I should make a note to myself to see if I can dig up those articles that can kind of substantiate some of that, so that when we compile our own dossier, we can verify our sources. So, yeah, where were we? Right at that amazing point when we find out that Steele himself was best known for his investigation into FIFA. Even if Mueller doesn't hire anybody else, that's pretty amazing because, look, Chris Steele is going to be wrapped up in this at some point, again, when it comes to actual investigation under Mueller's leadership. Okay, so where were we? Best known for investigation of FIFA, which provided direct support to the FBI's successful corruption case. Steele and Orbis were also known for assisting various European countries in understanding Russian efforts to meddle in their affairs, in the way that Paul Ryan and Kevin McCarthy were obviously aware of when they were taped in May of 2016, saying what a terrible thing it was that this was happening all over the world and likely to happen in the United States too. And everyone please shut up about it, because the plan is to help Republicans with this meddling. So as Americans, we must pretend not to care about it and to actually actively root for it. Like any private firm, Orbis's ability to remain in business relies on its track record of credibility. Also a good point. Success for Steele and his colleagues depends on his integrity, reliability, and the firm's reputation for serious work. In this regard, Steele is putting his reputation and his company's continued existence on the line with each report. Yes, as with anyone operating in the murky world of intelligence, he could be duped. Nonetheless, his reputation for handling sensitive Russian espionage operations over the years suggests that he is security conscious and aware of Russian counterintelligence and disinformation efforts. His willingness to share his work with professional investigative agencies such as the FBI and the British Security Service also suggests that he is comfortable opening his work to scrutiny and is seen as a serious partner by the best in the business. The biggest problem with confirming the details of the Steele dossier is obvious. We do not know his sources other than via the short description in the reports. In CIA's clandestine service, we spend by far the bulk of our work finding, recruiting, and validating sources. Before we would ever consider disseminating an intelligence report, we would move heaven and earth to understand the access, reliability, trustworthiness, motivation, and dependability of our source. We believe it is critical to validate the source before we can validate the reliability of the source's information. How does the source know about what he or she is reporting? How did the source get the information? Who are his or her sub-sources? What do we know about the sub-sources? Why is the source sharing this information? Is the source a serious person who has taken appropriate measures to protect their efforts? One clue as to the credibility of the sources in these reports is that Steele shared them with the FBI. The fact that the FBI reportedly sought to work with him and to pay him to develop additional information on the sources suggests that at least some of them were worth taking seriously. At the very least, the FBI will be able to validate the credibility of the sources and therefore better judge the information. As one recently retired senior intelligence officer with deep experience in espionage investigations quipped, I assign more credence to the Steele report knowing that the FBI paid him for his research. From my experience, there is nobody more miserly than the FBI. If they were willing to pay Mr. Steele, they must have seen something of real value. As outsiders, without the investigative tools available to the FBI, we can only look at the information and determine if it makes sense given subsequent events. Steele did not have the benefit of knowing Trump would win the election or how events might play out. In this regard, does any of the information we have learned since June 2016 assign greater or less credibility to the information? Were the people mentioned in the report real? Were their affiliations correct? Did any of the activities reported happen as predicted? Well, to a large extent, yes. The most obvious occurrence that could not have been known to Orbis in June of 2016, but shines bright in retrospect, is the fact that Russia undertook a coordinated and massive effort to disrupt the 2016 election to help Donald Trump, as the U.S. intelligence community itself later concluded. Well before any public knowledge of these events, the Orbis report identified multiple elements of the Russian operation, including a cyber campaign, leaked documents related to Hillary Clinton, and meetings with Paul Manafort and other Trump affiliates to reportedly discuss the receipt of stolen documents. Steele could not have known that the Russians stole information on Hillary Clinton or that they were considering means to weaponize them in the U.S. elections, all of which turned out to be stunningly accurate. The U.S. government only published its conclusions in January of 2017, with an assessment of some elements in October of 2016. It was also apparently news to investigators when the New York Times in July published Donald Trump Jr.'s emails arranging for the receipt of information held by the Russians about Hillary Clinton in a meeting that included Manafort. How could Steele and Orbis know in June of 2016 that the Russians were working actively to elect Donald Trump and damage Hillary Clinton unless at least some of its information was correct? How could Steele and Orbis have known about the Russian overtures to the Trump team involving derogatory information on Clinton? And remember, they wrote their report in June of 2016, and that meeting took place in June of 2016. Almost immediately, contemporaneously, Orbis and Steele knew about the Trump Tower meeting a year before we found out. Very interesting. We also have subsequently learned of Trump's long-standing interest in and experience with Russia and Russians. A February New York Times article reported that phone records and intercepted calls show that members of Trump's campaign and other Trump associates had repeated contacts with senior Russian officials in the year before the election. And hence all of the perjury cases that never really came to fruition, but all of our discovery of all the different Trump officials who lied to the Senate during their confirmation hearings, the multiple revisions by Jared Kushner of his own security disclosures, etc., etc., etc. Let's see. The Times article was also corroborated by CNN and Reuters independent reports, and even Russian officials have acknowledged that some of these and other repeated contacts did in fact take place. Although Trump has denied the connections, numerous credible reports suggest that both he and Manafort have long-standing relationships with Russians and pro-Putin groups. Last month, CNN reported on intercepted communications that U.S. intelligence agencies collected among suspected Russian operatives discussing their efforts to work with Manafort to coordinate information that could damage Hillary Clinton's election prospects, according to conversations with Manafort encouraging help from the Russians. We learned that when Carter Page traveled to Moscow in July of 2016, he met with close Putin ally and chairman of the Russian state oil company, Igor Sechin. A later Steele report also claimed that he met with Parliamentary Secretary Igor Divyekin while in Moscow. Investigative journalist Michael Isikoff reported in September of 2016 that U.S. intelligence sources confirmed that Page met with both Sechin and Divyekin during his July trip to Russia. That would be the month following the Trump Tower meeting. What's more, the Justice Department obtained a wiretap in summer of 2016 on Page after satisfying for a court that there was sufficient evidence to show Page was operating as a Russian agent. While the Orbis team had no way to know it, subsequent reports citing U.S. officials claimed that Washington-based diplomat Mikhail Kalugin was an undercover intelligence officer and was pulled out of the embassy and sent home in the summer of 2016. I think it's usually assumed at some level that they are intelligence agents. The Orbis documents refer repeatedly to Manafort's off-the-books payments from ousted Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych's pro-Russian party and Russian concerns that it may be a vulnerability that could jeopardize the effort. In other words, if all of America found out that Paul Manafort, the manager of the Trump campaign, was on the pro-Russian payroll, well, that could have negative effects for the Trump campaign. Time now, though, for us to bring in our outro music and get ready for the last of our station identification breaks. We'll be back after this. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show. Ooh, a quick fade out on the music there. See, I'm going to automate that too so that there's more consistency to that. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show on Netroots Radio. We last left off, I used the break to try and see if I could find some corroboration of the use of former FIFA investigators in Robert Mueller's Trump-Russia investigation. Of course, Mueller himself was director of the FBI during that investigation of FIFA, but I think I did turn something up that will help corroborate that claim, although it was a little more difficult than I thought it was going to be. So I'm curious. I'll have to double check and see what it was that I read, but I think there's clearly some connection. And of course, Mueller's own experience with the FIFA issue could become a factor in all of this if that's something he's got in the back of his mind as he pieces this all together. So where were we with this? Orbis documents were repeatedly referring to Manafort's having been paid by Viktor Yanukovych's pro-Russian party as the sort of problem which they worried, well, what if American fans of Donald Trump find out that he and his inner circle are all being paid off by Russians? Won't they be turned off by this? Because traditionally, Americans don't much like it when Russia tries to run American politics. I don't know if they've ever really tried that before, but, But apparently it turns out, just like shooting people on Fifth Avenue, it's okay. Americans are very happy to surrender their sovereignty to Russia if Mr. Trump says it's okay, or at least some portion of it, of this group. Though Greg keeps insisting that the polling shows that the group is ever shrinking. And that would make a great deal of sense, because it never really made any sense that this particular group of people would find themselves actively pro-Russian. I always thought that was a little bit weird. Okay, so according to the Orbis report, the Russians were concerned about further scandals involving Manafort's commercial and political role in Russia/Ukraine. And indeed, there have been further scandals since the Orbis reports were written. Those include Manafort being compelled in June to register retroactively as a foreign agent of a pro-Russian political party in Ukraine, Yanukovych's, of course, and Special Counsel Robert Mueller and the New York Attorney General's office reported investigation of Manafort for possible money laundering and tax evasion linked to Ukrainian ventures. We do not have any reporting that implicates Michael Cohen in meetings with Russians as outlined in the dossier. However, recent revelations indicate his long-standing relationships with key Russian and Ukrainian interlocutors and highlight his apparent role in a previously hidden effort to build a Trump Tower in Moscow. During the campaign, those efforts included email exchanges with Trump associate Felix Sater, and mobbed up Felix Sater at that, explicitly referring to getting Putin's circle involved and helping Trump get elected. Further, the Trump administration's efforts to lift sanctions on Russia immediately following the inauguration seems to mirror Orbis's reporting related to Cohen's alleged promises to Russia, as reported in the Orbis documents. A June Yahoo News article by Isikoff described the administration's efforts to engage the State Department about lifting sanctions almost as soon as they took office. Their efforts were halted by State Department officials and members of Congress. Following the inauguration, Cohen was allegedly involved again with Felix Sater in back-channel negotiations seeking a means to lift sanctions via a semi-developed Russian-Ukrainian plan, which also included the hand delivery of derogatory information on Ukrainian leaders. This also would fit with Orbis reporting related to Cohen. The quid pro quo, as alleged in the dossier, was for the Trump team to sideline the Ukrainian issue in the campaign. We learned subsequently that the Trump Platform Committee changed only a single plank in the 60-page Republican platform prior to the Republican convention. Of the hundreds of Republican positions and proposals, and remember, he's Mr. Independent, right? He's upending 150 years of two parties, blah, blah, blah. Out of hundreds of the pages of positions and proposals, they altered only the single sentence that called for maintaining or increasing sanctions against Russia, which is where Republicans traditionally are, increasing aid for Ukraine, and providing lethal defensive weapons to the Ukrainian military. The Trump team reportedly changed the wording to the more benign appropriate assistance. Consider, in addition, the Orbis report saying that Russia was utilizing hackers to influence voters and referring to payments to hackers who had worked in Europe under Kremlin direction against the Clinton campaign. A January Stanford study found that fabricated stories favoring Donald Trump were shared a total of 30 million times, nearly quadruple the number of pro-Hillary Clinton shares leading up to the election. Also in November, researchers at Oxford University published a report based on analysis of 19.4 million Twitter posts from early November prior to the election. That report found that an automated army of pro-Trump chatbots overwhelmed Clinton bots 5-1 in the days leading up to the presidential election. In March 2017, former FBI agent Clint Watts, there he is again. How does he do it? Clint Watts ought to get together with Hope Hicks. Clint Watts told Congress about websites involved in the Russian disinformation campaign, some of which mysteriously operate from Eastern Europe and are curiously led by pro-Russian editors of unknown financing. The Orbis report also refers specifically to the aim of the Russian influence campaign, quote, to swing supporters of Bernie Sanders away from Hillary Clinton and across to Trump, unquote, based on information given to Steele in August of 2016. It was not until March of 2017, however, that former director of the National Security Agency, retired General Keith Alexander, in Senate testimony said of the Russian influence campaign, quote, what they were trying to do is to drive a wedge within the Democratic Party between the Clinton group and the Sanders group. Does anybody think they might have succeeded in that? It certainly appears to be the case. A March news report also detailed that Sanders supporters' social media sites were infiltrated by fake news originating from dubious websites and posters linked back to Eastern Europe that tried to shift them against Clinton during the general election. Now, again, our statistics and polling say that they weren't successful with the overwhelming majority of those who voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary because there weren't idiots. But some percentage it did work for. But I think, of course, to be kind about it, we could say, to be kind to the rest of Bernie Sanders supporters anyway, we could say there was a certain percentage who were entering the Bernie Sanders camp either without the best of intentions or not as Democrats or merely as Clinton haters or just as blank slate moronic idiots who were there more for the bad news about Hillary Clinton than the good news necessarily about Bernie Sanders. But I don't think, all indications are that there just weren't that many of them. But again, this was an extraordinarily close election and really could and should have gone the other way, but for the movement of a very small number of people. And you only need to find a certain number of idiots in a certain number of places to make this work. And again, the vast majority of those particular idiots were inclined prior to Russian interference to probably do something almost exactly like what they ended up doing. But they had themselves their goofy worldviews, which they probably considered to be outlandish. They knew to be outlandish with respect to what others were doing and saying and feeling politically. And that tended to keep them more or less underground or hidden and not particularly interested in showing up at the polls. But suddenly the world seemed to be aligning with their views and encouraging them to come out and to make their views known and to vote. And that, that may have done the trick. May have. That's all we can say at this point. But it's starting to look like, yeah, that might be really a coherent narrative after all. John Mattis, to return to our article here, a former Senate investigator who helped run the online campaign for Sanders, said he was struck by Steele's report. Mattis said Steele, quote, was writing in real time about things I was seeing happening in August, but I couldn't articulate until September. It is important to emphasize here that Steele's source for the change in plan was, quote, an ethnic Russian associate of Republican U.S. presidential candidate Donald Trump, who discussed the reaction inside his camp. A slew of other revelations has directly tied many of the key players in the Trump campaign, most notably Manafort, Page, Cohen, and Michael Flynn, the spy, Michael Flynn, who are specifically mentioned in the Orbis reports to Russian officials also mentioned in the reports. To take one example, the first report says that Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov was responsible for Russia's compromising materials on Hillary Clinton, and now we have reports that Michael Cohen had contacted Peskov directly in January of 2016, seeking help with a Trump business deal in Moscow. This was after Cohen received the email from Trump business associate Felix Sater saying, quote, "Our boy can become president of the USA and we can engineer it. I will get all of Putin's team to buy in on this." To take another example, the third Orbis report says that Manafort was managing the connection with the Kremlin, and we now know that he was present at the June 9th, 2016 meeting with Donald Trump Jr., Russian lawyer Natalia Veselnitskaya, and Rinat Akhmetshin, who has reportedly boasted of his ties to and experience in Soviet intelligence and counterintelligence. According to an August 21st New York Times story, Akhmetshin told journalists that he was a longtime acquaintance of Paul Manafort. But of course, it was in New York Times, so Paul J. Manafort. The Orbis reports chronicle and subsequent events demonstrate that the Russian effort evolved over time, adapting to changing circumstances. When their attacks seemed to be having an effect, they doubled down. And when it looked like negative media attention was benefiting Clinton, they changed tactics. The Orbis reports detail internal Kremlin frictions between the participants as the summer wore on. If the dossier is to be believed, the Russian effort may well have started as an anti-Clinton operation and only became combined with the separate effort to cultivate the Trump team when it appeared Trump might win the nomination. The Russian effort was aggressive over the summer months, but seemed to back off and go into cover-up mode following the Access Hollywood revelations. Even they were embarrassed about that, and the Obama administration's acknowledgement of Russian interference in the fall. Perhaps they realized they might have gone too far and were possibly benefiting Clinton. I guess they possibly, of course, they may have said, oh, the Access Hollywood thing means that our compromat is worth less than it was before because here's some right here. Then it didn't work, so they ramped it back up. However, when Trump won, they changed again and engaged with Ambassador Kislyak in Washington to get in touch with others in the Trump transition team. As this process unfolded, control of operation on the Russian side passed from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to the FSB and later to the presidential administration. It should be noted in this context that the much-reported meetings with Ambassador Kislyak do not seem to be tied to the conspiracy. He's not an intelligence officer and would be in the position to offer advice on politics, personalities, and political cultures in the United States, but would not be asked to engage in espionage activity. It is likewise notable that Ambassador Kislyak receives only a passing reference in the Steele dossier and only having to do with his internal advice on the political fallout in the U.S. in reaction to the Russian campaign. Of course, to determine if collusion occurred as alleged in the dossier, we would have to know if the Trump campaign continued to meet with Russian representatives subsequent to the June meeting. As mentioned, in February, the Times, CNN, and Reuters reported that members of Trump's campaign and other Trump associates had repeated contacts with senior Russian officials in the year before the election, according to current and former American officials. Subsequent reports cite receipt of intelligence from European security agencies reporting on odd meetings between Trump associates and Russian officials in Europe. And perhaps the best clue that there might be something to the narrative of meetings in the summer of 2016 was former CIA Director John Brennan's carefully chosen phrase in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee about the contacts. Quote, "Frequently, people who go along a treasonous path do not know they are on a treasonous path until it is too late." Unquote. This period will likely be the one most closely scrutinized by FBI investigators. There is also information in the Steele reports that appears wrong or questionable. For example, the notion that Steele and his team could develop so many quality sources with direct access to discussions inside the Kremlin is worth serious skepticism. The CIA and other professional intelligence services rarely developed this kind of access despite expending significant resources over decades, according to published accounts. It is also hard to believe that Orbis could have 4 separate sources reporting on the alleged sexual incident at the Moscow hotel. The reputation of the elite hotel in the center of Moscow depends on the discretion of its staff, and crossing the FSB is not something taken lightly in Russian society. A source that could be so easily identified would be putting themselves at significant risk. Further, additional information in the reports cannot be checked without the tools of a professional investigative service. Of course, since the dossier was leaked and we do not have additional follow-up reports, we don't know if Orbis would have developed other sources or revised their reporting accordingly as they were able to develop feedback. We also don't know if the 35 pages leaked by BuzzFeed is the entirety of the dossier. I suspect not. So, more than a year after the production of the original Raw reports, where do we stand? I think it's fair to say that the report is not garbage, as several commentators claimed. The Orbis sources certainly got some things right, details that they could not have known prior. Steele and his company appear serious and credible. One large portion of the dossier is crystal clear, certain, consistent, and corroborated. Russia's goal all along has been to do damage to America and our leadership role in the world. And that's done, right? I mean, Trump did it himself, but of course it's done best if you can install Trump, and they certainly claim to be, or appear to be claiming to have done just that. Also, the methods described in the report fit the Russians to a T. If the remainder of the report is largely true, Russia has a powerful weapon to help achieve its goal. Even if it's largely false, the Kremlin still benefits from the confusion, uncertainty, and political churn created by the resulting fallout. We're also suspicious of Russia and Russian influence that we'll see it anywhere. We do have to be careful, but the Russians don't care whether we're careful or not, right? They just want us confused, and that is working. In any regard, the administration could help cauterize the damage by being honest, transparent, and assisting those looking into the matter. Sadly, the president has done the opposite, ensuring a Russian win no matter what. In any event, I would suspect the Russians will look to muddy the waters and spread false and misleading information to confuse investigators and public officials. As things stand, both investigators and voters will have to examine the information in their possession and make sense of it the best they can. Professional investigators can marry the report with human and signals intelligence. They can look at call records, travel records, interview people mentioned in the report, solicit assistance from friendly foreign police and intelligence services, subpoena records, and tie it to subsequent events that can shed light on the various details. We, on the other hand, will have to do our best to validate the information at hand. Looking at new information through the framework outlined in the Steele document is not a bad place to start. Well, I think a really interesting report and fodder for a lot of discussion along the way that I think helps tie some of these things together. I don't even know what else can we fit in here. I wanted to, the end of the story made me think, perhaps we ought to look more at, what was I thinking about? The corroboration and the call records, and it made me think about Chris Kobach and his crazy voter fraud ideas, because that's been in the news lately too, and I think that there are some call records that rang a bell for me. We'll save that perhaps for another day and see if instead we can't shoehorn in one more report. I don't think we can get the whole thing in there. Two competing things. One also from the Daily Beast, and then one in Mother Jones. Let me at least make mention of both. Betsy Woodruff, who's done a great job with this stuff for the Daily Beast, has a new entry in the rogues gallery of characters here. The characters, in fact, who tried to make Trump Tower Moscow a reality. It's not just Michael Cohen here. Just when you thought Putin's circle and Trump's couldn't be any more intertwined, Meet these two tycoons, says Betsy Woodruff. Let's at least find out who they are. While he was running for president, Donald Trump's company nearly inked a deal to build Trump Tower Moscow. Meanwhile, of course, a few months later, he says, I had no deals there, right? Remember that? Well, that's why I say his disavowals of things are usually the best corroboration that they really happened. Just as I promised no more foreign deals now that I'm president. Boom, foreign deals. I promise no more use of foreign contractors on existing deals. Boom, they just broke that one the other day. Anyway, Betsy Woodruff reporting here. It was a dream years in the making and helped along the way by two New York real estate tycoons, one of whom is considered the right-hand man of an oligarch linked to an infamous money laundering investigation. Naturally, this man is also considered a friend of Vladimir Putin. You don't get to put your hands on and keep large amounts of cash in Russia unless you are considered a friend of Vladimir Putin. The two tycoons, Alex Sapir and Rotem Rosen, accompanied Donald Trump on his 2013 trip to Russia, where they reportedly tried to pull strings behind the scenes in order to make Trump Tower a reality in Moscow. It's yet another set of connections between Putin's circle and Trump's, and it's of concern to Martin Scheel, a retired IRS criminal investigator, who told the Daily Beast that the links between the tycoons, their allies, and Trump are all just very suspicious and raises a lot of questions. Maybe that's the stage we're at here, and we can't get any further on it. But long story here, probably, maybe could fit the majority of it in here, but that would leave me without an opportunity to bring up the Mother Jones piece by David Korn, entitled How Donald Trump Lied to Conceal His Moscow Business Partner. Perhaps this was his greatest deception of the 2016 campaign, Korn says. Who are we talking about? Well, it's Felix Sater. So it's not a new name on the roster, but an interesting point being made here that he went, in fact, to great lengths to cover up his association with Sater. We understand why. I mean, he was mobbed up and dirty, and it was going to lead to all sorts of information about his work on Moscow Trump Tower and all the various corrupt deals and the amazing amount of overlap between his circle and Putin's. But two things that are out there for us to explore and discuss in the coming days. Okay, so since we can't get through much of those two articles, but at least we have them on record, let's see what other things we might need to put on the reading list. There is some more information about from Salon about the inside the president's not so blind trust. We're definitely going to want to read a little bit about that one, and well, a number of other things here that we should probably get in on, and we still have to get back to that Jonathan Tepper story about the amazing number of U.S. luxury real estate deals that lead to suspicions of money laundering. And let's see. Oh, yes. Maybe we'll just toss this one in there just for fun. Lots of things we're still skipping here. But David Ingram has a interesting Twitter storm, if you'll tweet storm on Twitter, a tech correspondent for Reuters. He responded to, I didn't see the initial comment, but here he says, I'm getting questions, so this subject is worth addressing in a thread. Why do Facebook political ads, remember the controversial ones paid for by Russians, not need disclaimers? It's true, no disclaimers are required, he says earlier on. Well, I'm not sure how many people will read this thread on a Saturday, that's when it came out, but here it goes. He says, bottom line up front, Facebook has persuaded the FEC to treat its political ads as if they were skywriting or novelty items like buttons and pencils. That means Facebook ads don't need disclaimers. This in turn makes it easier for interest groups or other advertisers to hide their identity, something Russians might like to do, by the way. Skywriting is literally in the U.S. campaign finance regulations, by the way. It appears here, a disclaimer is not required when it cannot be conveniently printed for example, on small items like pens, bumper stickers, campaign pins, campaign buttons, etc., or its display is not practicable, for example, wearing apparel, water towers, and skywriting, or the item is of minimal value and does not contain a political message and is used for administrative purposes. Anyway, he continues on with this tweet storm. In 2011, as Facebook advertising was still in its infancy, their lawyers wrote to the FEC to inquire about political disclaimers. Facebook's lead lawyer was Mark Elias. You know him, perhaps, from Twitter. His other clients have included Hillary Clinton and other high-profile Democrats. The lawyers had a request for the FEC. Could you please confirm Facebook's view that it is not subject to disclaimer requirements? And David includes here a letter from Elias sent to the FEC in April of 2011, which you can read for yourselves. And here's a Politico story from the time, linked here, the headline saying, Facebook, exempt us from FEC rules. The social media giant is looking for a sort of corporate privacy setting of its own. David Ingram continues, one argument was that internet advertising was relatively new and innovation shouldn't be burdened by regulation. And also, ad disclaimers can be intrusive, hence the exemption for small items like pencils and impractical situations like skywriting. One way to look at the question before the FEC was, is Facebook more like TV or more like skywriting? I would say TV, but they said skywriting. The FEC, a deeply divided agency, debated the subject before, surprise, deadlocking 3-3 in June of 2011. Half the FEC wanted to give Facebook a blanket exemption. Half opposed an exemption, but wanted to give Facebook lots of ways to comply. For example, linking to a page with a disclaimer. The deadlock meant Facebook basically got what it wanted. The FEC would not require disclaimers. The FEC could revisit this. It had a comment period last year, actually. I'm not sure what the result of another vote would be. One way to look at this, the one time that I'm aware of when Facebook weighed in on U.S. campaign regulation, it lobbied against it. So he says, hat tip to @CampaignLegal, among others, for explaining all this to me in recent months. It's not something that he came up with all on his own. He had help. One last point, Facebook doesn't know in real time which ads on Facebook are related to U.S. elections, and it doesn't ask advertisers. That's going to make it a little bit difficult to monitor such things, right? Nomiki Konst replies to him herein. I actually brought that up years ago when they started. Is there a legal exemption? Is there equal time law? Well, they're effectively exempt from all of that, says Ingram, and much more in subsequent discussions. But real interesting, I thought. Just a good thing that we could fit in at the end, an important piece of the puzzle as we find out more and more about what Facebook did, what it accepted money for, and what it ignored under its own nose, possibly in exchange for cash payment. But that's the business they're in. Anyway, lots of other stories happened today, I'm sure. Some of them didn't even have Ted Cruz in them. The guys in the after show know what they are and are going to bring them to you next. And they go with something like this. A Kansas bank has an entire Arab American family arrested after the father tries to deposit a check from an escrow company for the sale of their house. Oh, they must be terrorists, right? There you go. A Washington state sheriff is sorry he posted an All Lives Splatter meme that glorifies running over liberal protesters. Huge meme among the weirdos of the alt-right. No wonder they did it. And the Turkey Point, Florida nuclear power plant did not meet federal safety regulations as it continued to dangerously operate during Hurricane Irma.
From Daily Kos Radio on netrootsradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
Kansas, much in the news. They'll be talking with Chris Reeves on the second half of the show for a discussion on a federal report that cites how Kansas has failed its nursing home residents. A Missouri Democratic leader calls for a Republican state representative's resignation over his calls for lynchings, and much, much more on the After Show with Wink and Justice next.